were, talk about kind of navigating the different worlds. And I'm going to preface this with a little story. So I wrote a piece not too long ago about parenting, and particularly parenting my daughter, and issues of body image and food. And I talked about my own childhood. And so I shared this piece with my mom.
Uh-oh.
And yeah, well, yeah. It was one that I was like, okay, I'm exposing myself, being vulnerable. And she took it as, why didn't I know this when you were growing up? And took it as this failure on her part to know these things. And of course, I was like, well, I didn't really know them then either. Right. I couldn't express them. So how do you navigate those different spaces where you're exposed, you're vulnerable, and you're talking about things, but you also don't want to hurt others in the process?
Oh, look, I have a book coming out in October called Blinded by the Whites, Why Race Still Matters in the 21st Century. And Marx read a piece in an essay that came out in Palimpsest where I talk about some sexual abuse in my family. And it's going to be part of a chapter in that book. And the reality is, anytime you talk about these kind of taboo subjects or whatever, there is the potential for there to be controversy. There is the potential for you to, upset some folks. But here's the thing. You can't do the kind of work that we're doing and be safe.
Yeah.
Right? You can't do the kind of work that we do and then want to kind of bob and weave and let the women take the hits. And then we get in there and we pat them on the back. I mean, I'm reminded of that moment in James Baldwin with The Fire Next Time, where he talks about that white guy who saddled up to him when they were in the bar in the airport, and then waited till after the commotion about him getting a drink, him and his friends getting a drink was clear, and then came over there and tried to snuggle up to him. And Baldwin said, really, I don't have anything to say to you, because when the heat was on,
right,
we're in the back being silent. And now that it's all good, now you're coming over here, you're trying to get that cultural capital of saying, no, I'm not like them. No, you are like them. And so we really have to break that silence, and that costs us something. If you're not willing to pay something for these politics, then you're really not doing this kind of work, because it will cost you something, and that cost is high. But if you want to break, people, are always talking about generational curses and cycles or whatever. If you want to break these cycles, then you have to put yourself out there. You have to take some bullets, and that's just what it is.
Yeah.
So what so how did each of you carve out a space to talk about feminism, to talk about male feminism, to talk about black male feminism, to advancing a feminist politic without, well, maybe not without, while recognizing male privilege? So the fact that male privilege will create a space to speak, will lead to accolades. So how do you navigate that kind of tension of both giving voice but not silencing at the same time?
If we go back and look at, for instance, at Gary Lemons' work, the stuff that he's done, for instance, on W. Du Bois and Frederick Douglass, and talking about them as kind of black male pro-feminist forefathers. You look at Gary's own career, as someone who would identify as a black male feminist, what makes, say, a Gary very different than, say, David and I. David and I come through a period of time where we can identify black women who were feminists or black women who weren't feminists, who were scholars, who were advocates for the kind of work that we do. In many ways, we're a product of our politics. We're also the product of a particular kind of training.
Right.
So
Shout
the
out to
fact
Nellie
that
McKay. Right.
exactly right. The fact that David had a Nellie McKay, the fact that literally, Masani Alexis DeVoe picked me out of a crowd, in one of these kind of pre-gatherings for graduate school, and we had our first conversation, and it's almost as if she made a decision, right? I see something in your politics that is of value, and I'm going to make sure that when you come out on the other side, that those politics are affirmed, and you are comfortable enough in those politics to do the kind of work that we need you to do. I always remind folks that, for a book like New Black Man or the blog, which is, the current iteration of it, that wasn't my idea. That was Alexis DeVoe saying, "No, this is who you are." You need to claim that, because for you to claim this does a certain kind of political work that is important, to the lives that Black women live, and the kind of things and the kind of allies that we need in this kind of struggle. And I think what's been important is that, because we had these benefactors, right, there have been so many people, for lack of a better way to describe it, that have been willing to lay their hands on us. I remember meeting Joy James at a conference at Columbia, and this is after I had reviewed one of her earlier books on Shadow on Black feminism, and she was trying to figure out where I came from, right? And I told her, I was Masani Alexis DeVoe's student. She goes, "Oh, okay, I got you, I understand," right? Or someone like Beverly Guy Sheftel, who really is kind of functioned for me, on a regular basis, even more so than Masani, as this kind of figure who, is always kind of guiding me in the right kind of position and asking me to be able to weigh on certain kinds of things, because she knows that I can bring something to value as a male and as a Black male feminist. Those kind of relationships have been incredibly important for us to be able to do the kind of work that we do. I'm sure someone like Byron Hurt would say the same thing about his role as a filmmaker.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I would only just second what Mark said, and I think it's made it a lot easier as an entry point for people like me to get into the discourse. I distinctly recall when Nellie McKay was doing, they were contemplating doing a second edition of the Some of Us Are Brave anthology, and it was a meeting of Black feminist scholars from across the curriculum. It was a who's who, from Nell Painter to Beverly Guy Sheftal to, it was just, it was a spectacular, Deborah McDowell, you name it, they were in that room. And the only other men that were in the room was myself and Mike Alquist. And I didn't realize, I was too young and dumb to realize what a particularly spectacular moment that was, because I was just Nellie's student, and she just, Nellie just invited me. And I'll never forget, the conversation was going, and I didn't realize how much political capital Nellie had spent just to get me in that room. I remember the issue of Little Kim came up because these scholars were trying to figure out how did they want to kind of think about this new generation of hip hop artists and how they fit into the matrix of Black feminism. And I kind of jumped into the conversation and talked about whether there was some element of empowerment to trying to challenge certain notions of respectability, even as one retained their agency, because I thought, hey, I have something to say. Right. And I remember there was a cold silence that ran across the room. And I realized, uh-oh, I just stepped in something. And I remember all of them, there were the few scholars who looked dead at Nellie like, you know what, we would cuss him out. You know that, right? But we're not going to cuss him out because that's your boy. But know that that's what would have happened. Right. And I realize now, it's comical now thinking about it, but it's exactly what Mark has said. Nellie was like, just give him some time. He's marinated. Right. He's trying to figure this out. But he's a good guy. His politics are right. We just got to work. We got to work with the brother. Give him some, we got to help mold and shape. and his politics. And I'll never forget that moment. And at some point, I'll probably write about that. But Mark is absolutely right about having a sponsor.
So who beyond? I mean, you named those in the history and the trajectory that kind of not only laid the foundation but kind of ushered you through the process. Who else has been formative in your Black feminist sensibilities?
You know, for me, if I had to look at males, right, because it really is about how do you build a community of men who think about these issues and are willing to share. You know, the first Black man that I ever witnessed really identify himself distinctly with a feminist politics was Kevin Powell. And this is Kevin Powell writing in Ms. Magazine, 2000, 2001, owning up to male privilege, owning up to a kind of moment of violence in his life. He called himself a recovering misogynist. I hadn't seen much language like that. Greg Tate, in the many articles that he did in the Village Voice, during that great run in the 80s and early 1990s, he did a piece, talking about Miles Davis, his obituary piece on Miles Davis, in which he really held Miles Davis accountable, for his sexism and misogyny, right? And for me, that was always a great example, right? Identifying these kinds of folks. I think when Greg wrote that piece in 1991, he would never have called himself a Black male feminist. Right. I think he would think differently about that, in 2013, because there was no language for him to embrace it at that time. But the fact that he was willing to put that work out there has been very important. David, like myself, we've also been fortunate to have Black women peers, who have been incredible in terms of helping us to frame our conversation. For me, to have, someone who's been a lifelong friend like Joan Morgan, as almost my go-to, feminist sensibility, at any given time has been incredible. To be able to work with young students, someone like Treva Lindsay, who I had the chance to work with for 6 years, and her kind of take on Black feminism has directly had an impact on how I see that not only in my work, but in my everyday behavior. And of course, then I got these 2 Black girls, that I'm raising. These 2 Black girls, my mother, who would never have called herself a feminist, my mother-in-law, who would never call herself a feminist, a wife who doesn't call herself a feminist, though she has distinctly feminist critiques. These all shape a kind of way that, you think about the role of women in the world, particularly Black women in the world, and how my own politics and my own behavior, need to be in sync with some of these issues.
Right. Right. Let the church say amen. I think that's exactly right. I credit Mark with being very generous with his time and the conversations that we had. Of course, conversation that I developed with Michael Awkward, who allowed himself to be vulnerable in many of those moments, and who could have been really snooty and highbrow about being, a superstar, and yet was very humble and very helpful.
And Michael didn't have the kind of protection that we had. I mean, that's the other thing that's important about Michael's trajectory. No one was trying to pat him on the back for being in the room.
No. He took some heat, and if you follow his scholarship, he actually talks about it, right? Towards a Black male feminist criticism, which is obviously the iconic essay that he wrote. I mean, he talked about being approached by one scholar who, got in him pretty good because of something that he wrote. And unfortunately, I think for Michael, because he was one of the few men, and Black men in particular, who was actually attentive to some of these issues, he actually caught a lot of unnecessary heat.
Yeah.
I think he got some friendly fire in that regard. But it's never. This is not easy, and I can't tell you if I think a lot of times what we end up doing, and that's why these conversations with people in our space are so important, is that even as we know what's wrong, right, with these masculine scripts. The challenge is trying to talk and present one that is actually palatable to these communities that we're interested in reaching, right? The Pookies and the Nenes, right? And Tyrone Dems, right? That they actually can digest and actually make sense in the world. Because one thing that we should never discount, and this becomes very important, is that what the material cost of performing those masculinities are in various spaces, right? Oftentimes, I mean, Mark talks about this in Finding his Leroy book, right? Is that, you know, there are costs to performing certain kind of masculinities on the block. I mean, you could get beat up, right? You could get, I mean, you know what I'm saying? Like, or even as I'm going to be discussing in a project that I'm working on now, because this has been so like entrenched in the ways that a lot of Black women think, oftentimes they become policing elements of the same kind of masculinity. Right. So if your masculine performance is too feminine, right, or feminine seeming, then you get, right, downgraded there too. I think Joe Morgan touches on that in profound ways in Chicken Heads, which I think was why she also caught a lot of heat from more traditional Black feminists for that particular statement. But it's a complicated matrix. That's why these conversations and these sponsorships become so important.
So one of the things that, and Mark wrote about this in New Black Man, and I think I was probably reading it when my youngest was born, and so thinking about writing and talking as a parent became part of my language, and I tell this story in class about how when Rhea was 6 months, when I wasn't in class, I was taking care of her, and invariably I'd be out, and it was almost always an older white woman grandmother who'd come up and basically say, "Oh, isn't that sweet? You have a special day with Daddy."
Right.
And my immediate reaction was like, "No, this is every day."
Right. Yeah. Every day she has special days every day. Right.
Don't get it twisted. This is one, every day is special, but two, this is
Dad putting in work.
Exactly. So, but that was my initial reaction, and then as I grew and thought about it, I started to check myself in terms of my reaction of one, well, how many moms get walked up and get that praise?
Right.
Having an accept. And two, what's the larger context? What's the cost and consequence when we look at wage disparity? When we look at child care policy?
Right.
So talk to us about why bringing that connection to your daily practice as a parent, as a partner, is so important in your work.
You want to take it away, Mark? Or?
Yeah. Because part of it is that, the easy part is to do a Black male feminist critique of a Tyler Perry film. Right? And we get a couple of folks mad at us and wanting to say that Black male privilege is bullshit on Twitter. That's kind of the easy part of it, right? To actually embody this politic in our everyday life is the broader struggle. And when your case, David Leonard, David Eichert, where you have daughters, where I only have daughters, trying to find a way to help them navigate a world that's going to recognize their value as Black girls now, girls of color, and then women and Black women. That's when the things kind of, the rubber hits the road, if you will, for a bad cliche. And for me, it was a badge and honor in the early days, right? I literally remember, because in the early days of my career, my wife and I had very different trajectories, right? She was the star, You know, I was just a dude trying to finish the PhD and hopefully get some job teaching, you know, in an English department someplace. You know, she was the one who was generating, you know, all the heat and all the capital in those
And
early
the
days.
income coming in.
Exactly, right. And so in those early days, you know, the fact that I could stay home with the kids, you know, there was no choice in that conversation, right? That's what had to be done, right? If we were going to save money on childcare and things like that, you know, I had to stay home, you know, with the kids. And I remember the very first day I was home with my oldest daughter, and putting on Marvin Gaye and Tammy Terrell's "Ain't No Mountain High Enough," right? Because I wanted to introduce her to all of these Motown melodies and all this kind of stuff. And I did that for a day and was like, oh shit, you know,
I got to do it tomorrow.
This is not easy, right? You know, we take this for granted, and so you make it a part of your everyday reality. But you're right, David, when you're out there in the public sphere, I mean, the first thing I graded against, and I talk about this in New Black Man, you know, I'd have my daughters in these public spaces, and there were no changing rooms for men, right? You know, so, you know, there were changing stations in a woman's bathroom, but if you went into a men's bathroom, there was no changing stations in the late 1990s, right? We've seen all of that change, right, over the last 15 years, right? You'll have separate changing bathrooms, right, where men and women could go in to change the diaper of their kids. You know, like you, David Leonard, the number of people who came up to me to pat you on the back, right? Particularly because as a black man, oh my God, we didn't know black men ever did anything with their children. And I can still remember, dude, older, you know, he was like in his late 20s, in a class of mine talking about, we're having this conversation about men being engaged in parenting, and he just goes, what are you talking about? I babysit my kids. And it's like, the fact that you would even use that language to describe parenting, you know, describes the kind of distance that we have with this. You know, going to the doctor's offices and doctors never really knowing what to do with the father when the father's in the room.
Right.
And I'm always having this conversation about whether or not I'm a custodial parent.
Right.
Right. Which I know they never ask my wife when she's the one in the room with them, because they can't figure out what the father is doing there unless it's some, you know, responsibility, you know, out of divorce. Right. You know, that you know, this is your responsibility. This is not stuff that you do every day. And I think fundamentally in this society, we don't have a language to discuss men as engaged parents in general. But when you talk about black men, you know, because the default is always that we're not engaged. Right. You know, when we show in any kind of nominal behavior of you know, just being attentive, you know, folks want to grant us awards.
Oh, yeah.
You know, and you know, the president's rhetoric doesn't help that. You know, when he talks about these deficiencies, right, you know, in a very real way, you know, that doesn't help the rhetoric of these guys, you know, everyday kinds of black men who do parenting work on a daily basis.
Yeah, and that's right. I mean, I remember being in a restaurant with my son, and he was about 9 months old, and he was giggling. I was playing with him, and the waitress kept, you know, the server kept refilling my drink, and she wasn't refilling my wife at the time drink. And everybody was, you know, oohing and ahhing. All the women in the restaurant were oohing and ahhing, and I didn't realize just how much capital being a father had. And of course, I was basking in it. Right. And
you get caught up in it.
Yeah. And then I looked across the table, and the mother of my children is just like ready to strangle me. And I'm like, what am I, you know, why is that you know, why are you looking at me like that? And what I realized too in that moment was also how white privilege operates, right? How it is that you can get these privileges and not really be aware of them because they're so flattering and they're so complimentary, and you don't realize how what advantages you also disadvantages other people. But I will say too, though, I think Athena Mudawa's notion of gendered racism is